Well, again, it is good to be here. Good to see you today. Good to be looking around and seeing all of the wonderful reminders of fall that the flower ministry has brought in. I meant to mention that in the early service and forgot. I love the little grass. Not little, they're very tall, but there's something very delicate about them, and I really appreciate that. Because we are talking about women who move mountains, and while sometimes people think that we are delicate, we are strong. And we are reminded of that today as we learn about Esther. She is a woman who moved mountains with her courage. To explore courage through the lens of the story of Esther, we will need some background. And I'm going to try to take a stone and skip it over the top of the lake. I don't know that I did that very well this morning. I think I kind of droned on a little bit, so I'm going to try to be a little more concise, but we'll see what happens. The first thing we need to know is the book of Esther is set in Persia during what's known as the Jewish diaspora. Many Jews from the southern kingdom of Judah were removed from their homeland and taken to Persia as slaves. The story actually begins with the king hosting a banquet for the important men of the kingdom. Now, I want to make sure that I stress important men, because the lower classes were not going to be invited to this. This was going to be that high stratus of socioeconomic persons who were movers and shakers in the Persian society. Meanwhile, his wife, Vashti, was hosting a banquet for the women as well. So the wives of these important men would be at a women's banquet. So we had a little segregation going on. And these feasts, these banquets would go on for many days. On the seventh day, the king, he's had, we can assume, because it says in the text that they were merry banquets. So we can assume that they probably had perhaps some alcohol flowing there. And the king, he'd been having a lot of fun. Let's put it that way. He's been having a lot of fun. And sometimes when people get alcohol in them and they get around their friends, that they get a little boisterous, they get a little boastful, they get a little, my kingdom's bigger than your kingdom. And he thinks, okay, well, I'm going to show these people just how important I am, just how wonderful I am, because I'm going to have my wife. I'm going to command the eunuchs to bring my wife into this banquet. Now remember, we're segregated here, men over here, women over here. Never the twain shall meet, unless the king says so. And the king wanted his wife to come in. Now, the story does not say specifically, but according to custom, what he really wanted was for his wife to come in and dance in front of all these men naked. Nude, no clothes on. And his wife says, no. Now, this is a king of Persia to whom she is saying no. We don't really know what happens to Vashti other than we are told that she is banished from his sight, but the most common way of banishing someone from the sight of the king was to, anybody? Execute her. Yes, she very likely was killed. So, the king needs a new queen. Somehow or another, Esther is chosen. We don't exactly know how that happens, because the interesting thing about Esther is that she is a Jew. Now, we're told in the story that it's kept secret, that nobody knows it. So the king does not know that he's marrying a Jew. He chooses her and does marry her. And so our story begins. Esther has a cousin named Mordecai. He also plays very prominently in this story. He is the one who has brought forth Esther as a possibility for queen. And I'm not accusing Mordecai of any trickery, but I really don't understand how a Jewish slave, because Mordecai would have been brought to Persia as a slave, how did a Jewish slave have the wherewithal to put forth his cousin, who also happened to be his adopted daughter, as queen? That's a backstory I'd like to know. But we are not told. We just know that over her he has authority. Unfortunately, sometime after Esther becomes queen, Mordecai gets into trouble. And he gets into trouble because he will not conform to the customs of Persia. The custom was, in the ancient Near East, that the king and the king's representatives were honored with either bows or some sign of respect. Mordecai would not do so. Anybody have an idea why Mordecai refused to do so? Any thoughts? The Jews were to, yes, Maggie. Absolutely. She is basically quoting the first two of the 10 commandments. Thou shalt not have another God above me, and you shall not bow down to anything or anyone. That's exactly right. So he wasn't going to do it. So Haman has come to the gate, and everybody else at the gate is bowing down and bowing down. And Mordecai won't do it. Now that just cannot be tolerated. And we're kind of told in the story anyway that there's some animosity between the Persians and the Jews, even though the Jews were there as slaves and servants. They weren't really welcome. And so Haman begins to plot. He thinks of a way to get the Jews killed. And the plot basically is he tells the king that, hey, they're plotting against you. They won't do what they're supposed to do. They're resisting. They're plotting a rebellion. And of course, the king said, yep, I'm going to sign that decree. We're going to kill them all. Mordecai hears of this and becomes very distressed. In fact, he tears his clothes and puts on sackcloth and ashes, and he goes through the city wailing and weeping. Nothing like making a spectacle of yourself, now is there? Now, the other thing to remember here is that the Jews already were somewhat set apart, partly because they won't bow down to the king and the king's representative, but also they won't follow the food customs of the place in which they live, because they have their own food customs. They're not to eat certain meats. The meat is supposed to be prepared a certain way. And a lot of times the slaves and the servants ate that which was sacrificed to the king, because the king was considered a god with a little g, not a big G. And so sacrifice was done, and that meat was given to be eaten. And the Jews were, no, we're not eating that. So they already were considered a little bit strange. And so here comes Mordecai. He is, again, distraught. And this was a very common way in the ancient Near East to show distress. Put on a sackcloth, put ashes on your face, and wail. If there was a death of someone who was very important to the community, you put on sackcloth and ashes and you wailed. If there was a long-lasting drought, some other kind of a natural disaster that had caused a lot of harm, it also was a way to show humility. But Mordecai, he's drawn attention upon himself, and Esther gets very concerned because not only is Mordecai doing it, but all of the Jews were doing it. And again, the king doesn't know that Esther is a Jew. So she's kind of like, okay, you need to calm down. So she sends garments out to try to get Mordecai to put them on, but he won't accept them. And so Esther wants to know what's going on. She sends her eunuchs out. Mordecai explains, this is what's happening. And in fact, Esther is asked to do something in the message that is sent back from Mordecai to Esther. And Esther responds saying, I can't do anything. I am just the queen. Now let's stop right there. We might think, what? She's the queen. Why can she not do something? And in fact, in Wednesday night's small group study, there was a question. Is she not married to the king? As if she would have any clout with the king? Well, that's what we in our modern time might expect, but it's important to remember that during this period of time, this was a marriage of convenience. When Esther was brought before the king, he didn't go, oh, I love you so much. I want to make you my wife. Instead, he examined her, looked at her hips. Are you of good childbearing form? Yes, you are, and you are beautiful to boot. Therefore, you will be my wife. There was no love between them. At least, that was not common. It was not the prerequisite for marriage. So many times, the king and the queen didn't even see each other. As with the banquet, the king was over here, the queen was over there. The king had his servants, the queen had her servants, mainly women, but sometimes eunuchs as well. And the queen couldn't just pop in and say, hey, hubby, I got something I want to talk to you about. No, she had to formally request a visit. And what she sends back to Mordecai is, I haven't even seen him for 30 days. How am I supposed to talk to him? The response that Mordecai sends back is the response that we hear today. Basically, Esther, you may not escape the king's wrath as well. You may be killed in this. For some reason, she has a change of heart. And we don't really know why. It could be because Mordecai was her adoptive father, and he carried a lot of clout with her. It could be that he framed it in such a manner that she went, oh yeah, I forgot. I am a Jew, and I might get killed in this execution as well. It could be that the Holy Spirit moved her. I don't really know. But she has a change of heart. She says, okay, I'm going to do this. Mordecai, tell the people to have a fast. I'll figure out how to get this done. So, in essence, she goes out kind of in the hallway or the vestibule outside of the king's court and kind of waits for him to notice her. And when he notices her, he gives her, and we had a hard time coming up with what the name of this was on Wednesday night. All I could think of was a stick. Have you ever sat around in a listening circle and you have to have the stick to talk? So it was, it's some kind of a stick. No, it was a golden scepter. So kind of sort of a stick, only far more expensive and elaborate. But he hands her the scepter and allows her to come in. Now, if you've got your bulletin handy, would you look at the picture on the front? I specifically picked this picture, this image. Can anybody tell me why I might have picked that? Maggie. Okay. Yep, he's giving her permission to come forward. But there is a threat there as well. Remember what happened to his first wife? There's a reason that there's a spear in this image. There is a man there with a spear. Just because this is his wife does not mean he trusts her or trusts anybody. Kings are not necessarily the most trusting people, and rightly so. So even though this is his wife, there's got to be some protection. Just keep that, just kind of keep that in your mind. So he allows her to come in, and she basically says, hey, I want to have a dinner, and I want to invite this lovely man named Haman over. He is not a lovely man. He's an awful man. He's the one who's plotting to kill the Jews. But she doesn't frame it that way. So the king says, okay, we'll do that. And so Haman is invited to this dinner. And can you imagine what Haman thought? I bet he thought, yeah, I'm in it now. I'm coming to see the king, and his queen's going to be there, and she's beautiful, and yes. Except what happens when he comes in, the king says to Esther, now you have a petition for me. What is it? And she says, this man over here has duped you. He wants you to kill all the Jews for not a very good reason, and it's going to reflect badly on your reign. And the king is appalled, and instead of Esther being killed, Haman is killed. And the Jews are allowed to live as they wish, within reason, within the land of Persia. So today's message is about courage. Esther shows courage. She shows courage by being willing to stand up for her people. And even though, again, in the story, it's never said that the king finds out that she is a Jew, at least I don't recall, and I reread it yesterday, but I don't recall that he realized that she's a Jew. But she stands up for her people, knowing she could be killed for it, knowing that that spear is always going to be right there. And all she has to do is misstep, and she's gone. She has courage because, in the first place, she agreed to be put forward as a possibility to marry the king when Vashti is executed. Esther could have told Mordecai, I'm not going to do that. Look what happened to the first one. But for some reason, she knew that it was important. And so she did it. I also noticed that in our reading today, Esther tells Mordecai, a woman tells a man, go and do. Now, that wasn't the normal situation back then. Sometimes now we can be a little pushy, yes, indeed, but back then you were not pushy, especially when this person, Mordecai, was he was a very well respected and had great authority in that Jewish community. But she says, go and do, and so she does. Esther exhibits courage with everything that she does. She exhibits courage when she's outside of the court, hoping that the king will notice her. She exhibits courage when she takes the scepter. She exhibits courage when she confronts Haman in person, because she could have just told the king, this is what happened, and let it be, and let the cards fall where they may. But no, instead, she openly confronts Haman. And she takes a chance because Haman was the king's right-hand man. There was no more guarantee that the king was going to believe Esther than he was going to believe what Haman said. Because I'm sure Haman says, well, wait, I didn't do anything. So I wonder if we were Esther, would we have the same courage? Would we have done the same thing? Or would we just have went, okay, I'm safe, I'm married to the king, I'm good. I'm just going to take the chance. I love Mordecai and I love my people, but I just don't want to get involved. How many times have you ever said that when you've seen something that's not been right and you just said, nope, I don't want to get involved. I don't want to put myself out there. I don't want to take that chance. We've all done that. Esther, whether she knew it or not, was in that place, in that time for a reason. And in fact, Mordecai reminds her of this. It could be, he says, that you were brought to royal dignity for such a time as this. What does this story tell you about the courage we need to change things we can? Again, in our youth group this morning, we talked about courage. One story was about standing up for someone who was being bullied. Someone that this particular person really didn't like all that well. And that says a lot. I remember early in my time in church being told about agape love. And that agape love was not a warm, fuzzy feeling toward another person, but it was that love that prompted you to do something even for someone you did not like. Oh, that's hard. That's really hard to do. That's also courage. But Esther is also willing to be vulnerable. She takes that chance. She kind of puts aside that, well, there's that spear right there. I'm going to put myself in a vulnerable situation, and I'm going to take the step in faith. And that's another piece of that puzzle, is that faith is important. Mordecai has very strong faith. He puts forth Esther as a possibility. He, knowing that he's going to make a spectacle of himself, puts on sackcloth, puts on ashes, and walks around the city wailing. He has that faith. Esther's faith wavered a little bit. Nope, I can't do that. No, I can't. But then something, as I said, reminds her, oh yeah, yep, I got to stand strong in my faith. So as we wrap up our story of Esther and this courageous woman, I want to ask you, what is God calling us to do? What is God calling us to have the courage to change in our own lives? Now, I've not shared a whole lot with you about my personal life, my previous life, but this seemed like the good time to do it. I struggled with drug and alcohol abuse when I was in high school and in college. I realized that it was not the path upon which I wanted to walk, but I needed some courage. Now, if anybody would have told me that I needed courage, I would have went like, no, that's not what I need. But I look back on it and I go, yeah, that's exactly what I need. And it wasn't the courage to stop the drinking and the smoking pot. It was the courage to choose to hang out with different people. Because the people I hung out with, they also drank and did drugs. And I can't speak for anybody else, but for me, it was very, very hard to change something in my life when I continued to put myself into that situation. So the courage I needed was the courage to make that change in my life, to do something different. What do we need to change in our community? That will take courage. It could be something here in Northeast Lincoln, as I mentioned last week. How can we serve in Northeast Lincoln? But what courage do we need to change, to advocate for, change in this community. Or it might be a broader lens of Lincoln or Lancaster County, and I want to stop and lift up justice in action. Because mercy is easy in that most of the time we just give money or we drop dried goods into the blessing box or something. It's real easy. A lot of times it's anonymous. People don't know that we're doing it. But if you work for justice, you're putting yourself out there. I was known in most of my churches as a pastor who promoted justice, and it wasn't always welcome. I never got tomatoes thrown at me, but I expected it once in a while. And I never knew if it was courage that I had or foolishness that drove me, but it was important. So Justice in Action is having kind of a I don't want to say a refresher meeting, but just kind of a check-in meeting. How's things going? We've been moving forward for about a year, been doing some house meetings. So Justice in Action is going to have an all communities gathering, all of the churches and communities that are involved in this broad project. They're coming together on November 6th from 6:30 to 8 at the East Ridge Presbyterian Church. It is in your announcements, so if you need more information, we'd love it if you'd just pop in, even if you're like, I'm not quite ready to make that step to be involved. Just step in and see what's happening. Find out what's happening. And to remind you, the two focal points of Justice in Action in Lancaster County: prison reform and mental health. They are two subjects that are very important, perhaps to ourselves. Maybe we know someone, a loved one or a friend who is incarcerated. Perhaps we have some of our own mental health issues. I've struggled with depression. And so, those are things that touch each of us. What is God calling us to do that requires courage in our world? I can't speak for you, but I listen to the news and I get really frustrated because I just feel like there's nothing I can do to help. I can't do anything. But last Sunday, there was a letter writing campaign downstairs in the fellowship hall, writing to our federal representation. And it may fall on deaf ears, but at least they know. At least they know where the people of this church stand, their constituents stand. And if enough people write letters, something might get done. For whom have we been put in our current situation for just such a time as this? Esther was in the right place at the right time. Where are you at? That if you'll just have a little bit of courage, you could make a difference. And how do we, like Esther, find the courage to go before the king, and you can fill in the blank on what that king looks like, to advocate for those who are voiceless and marginalized? I think it was the Nehemiah assembly earlier this year where the groups from Justice in Action came before some important people, county commissioners, so on and so forth, to say, we're concerned about those who are imprisoned. We're concerned about those who are dealing with mental health issues. That takes courage. So here are some thoughts for us to kind of close this particular portion of the worship, and yet hold it maybe in our hearts as we go through this week. One of the things that's important as we try to grasp courage is to hold on to that faith in the Lord our God, and to hold the words of Scripture tight to our heart, to keep them within our hearts, so they can be a healing balm for all. And we also need to be focused, because those who want us to fall off the path will try to distract us. We need to be focused. Proverbs 4 says, "Let your eyes look directly forward and your gaze be straight before you. Do not swerve to the right or to the left. Turn your foot away from evil." I did not suddenly turn from drug and alcohol use to, oh, I'm free. But I had to keep working at it. And I work with a program, I work full-time. For those of you who don't know that about, I do work full-time. And I work with Tobacco Free Nebraska. One of the mantras in the Nebraska Tobacco Quit line is keep quitting. Now that sounds silly, doesn't it? If you quit, you quit. No, anybody who's tried to quit something that is a habit knows that you just don't quit. You gotta keep quitting. You gotta keep trying to quit. The other thing I would recommend is let's hold on tight to our words from Psalms this morning. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? Wait for the Lord. Be strong, and let your heart take courage. And it ends with wait for the Lord. Now I'm going to add to that. Wait for the Lord, but don't wait forever. You won't get anything done. Wait for the Lord for guidance, and then take that first step in courage. Even if it's just to come step to the pulpit and speak in front of people. Take that first step, and the Lord will be with you until the end of the age. Amen.